Hey young friends, Dr. Bill here. I am so glad that you could join me for today's session. We're continuing to work through our Big Names in the Bible series, and today we're taking yet another look at the prophet Jeremiah. The story that I'm going to refer to today comes to us from Jeremiah chapter 32. Here's how it unfolds. At this juncture in the book of Jeremiah, the Babylonian army has captured much of the southern kingdom, the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, and they have surrounded the city of Jerusalem. It's only a matter of time before this city falls. Jeremiah is also in prison. He's in prison because he said things that were not popular. He had preached and said time and time again that there was no way that the city could hold out against the Babylonians, that God was judging the people for their failures and for their sins, and the city would fall, the temple would be destroyed, and the people would be carried off into exile. That did not go well with the folks there in Jerusalem, and so Jeremiah was put in prison. One day while he's in prison, one of his relatives comes to visit. And this relative has a very unusual offer to make to Jeremiah. He says, Jeremiah, you know, we have some family property there in our hometown of Anathoth. I think it's a good time for us to think about selling the property, and I wanted to know if you're interested in buying it. Now here's the catch. Anathoth, even though it was Jeremiah's hometown, was already taken over by the Babylonians. And so essentially, his relative was saying, I want you to buy a piece of property that you may never be able to inhabit, you'll never be able to do anything with. I mean, if the city falls and we're all carried off into exile, what good is a piece of property? I guess one way of describing it would be to think about the situation in the Ukraine today. I hope you're aware that Russia invaded the country of Ukraine. And even though, as I record this, the Ukrainians are fighting valiantly and they're holding their own against the Russians, there are parts of Ukraine that the Russians have succeeded in taking over. And so Jeremiah's story would be something like this. Suppose a relative came to you and said, hey, I have some property in the Ukraine. I'd like to sell it to you. There's just one catch. It's in territory occupied by the Russians. Now, I don't know whether they'll ever be booted out. I don't know whether you'll ever be able to make any use of this property, but nonetheless, I want to sell it to you. Do you think you'd take him up on that offer? I don't think so. Nevertheless, Jeremiah did something very, very unusual. His relative offered him the chance to buy the property in Anathoth, and even though he was in prison, even though the Babylonians were closing in, and even though exile was imminent, Jeremiah said yes. I'd like to go ahead and purchase that piece of property. Wow, that's pretty impressive, isn't it? Well, in doing this, Jeremiah was essentially buying a share in the future. He was saying, by the purchase of this property, I believe that even though we're surrounded by the Babylonians, we're going to be defeated by them, and we're going to be carried off in exile, I still believe that that's not the end of the story. I believe that there is a future for us and that God has something in store for us that's good and hopeful and positive beyond the time of exile and beyond the time of our captivity. So Jeremiah bought the field, and in so doing, he bought a share in the future. Now that's really important for us to think about. It's important for us to think about how we can give expression to our faith that God has a future for us, even though our circumstances may say otherwise. This crazy act of Jeremiah gives us two important things to talk about. The first is this: judgment is never God's last word. Yes, God had allowed the Babylonians to overtake much of the land of Israel. God had allowed the Babylonians to be able to surround the city of Jerusalem. And yes, the day would come when the city would be destroyed and also the temple. Those are all terrible things. But that was God's way of allowing the people of Israel to get what they had chosen. It was God's way of saying, you have failed to live up to my commandments and what I have asked of you. And because you've chosen this path, well, the end is destruction. That's not a really good message, is it? That's not very hopeful. But by buying this piece of property in Anatoth, Jeremiah was essentially saying to the people, yes, God's judgment is real, but it is never the last word. God is also in the business of creating futures. God is also in the business of trying to help us see that there are possibilities out there that God is going to be working on, and that even though our current circumstances may seem bleak, there's something to hope for and something to look forward to. That's lesson number one. Here's the second lesson. Lots of times we say, I hope for this or that. And hope often turns out simply to be wishful thinking. When we say, I hope, we're saying, hey, I wish. And we could say, hey, I wish I could win the lottery, or I wish that I could have good grades for the remainder of the school year. We can say, I hope for that, but it's all wishful thinking. Real hope takes action. Real hope does something to say to ourselves and others that we believe that what we hope for is going to come true. Jeremiah acted on his hope. He believed that God had a future for him and for his people, and so he bought the field. Hope means that we act as if something really is true, that we act as if something is already true. And so Jeremiah expressed his hopes by acting as if the exile was already over, and that God's new future and God's next step for the people, it was already present, already there. And so Jeremiah, by buying this field, turned his hope into real hope and made it more than wishful thinking. Well, that's it for today. As always, if you have any questions, you can email me, text me, give me a phone call, however you wish. I'd welcome the opportunity to speak with you. In the meantime, I hope the rest of this week goes really, really well for you, and I look forward to seeing you again for our lesson next week. You take care, and God bless. Bye-bye.